Con ustedes, Marian Tupy.
Hello, Mexico. It's good to be here. What I want to talk about today is population, resources, and innovation. In order to live, let alone to live well, all of us need resources. We need fuel, we need food, we need minerals, we need metals. But there are 8 billion of us. And so the question is, are there too few or too many people on Earth? Opinions differ.
The great under-discussed factor in the climate crisis is there are just too many of us, and we use too much shit. Climate deniers like to say, there's no population problem, just look out the window of an airplane, something but empty space down there. But it's not about space, it's about resources. Humans are already using 1.7 times the resources the planet can support. In 1900, there were less than 2 billion people on Earth. Now it's approaching 8. We can't just keep going on like this. The world is just too crowded.
There are not enough people. I can't emphasize this enough. There are not enough people. I think one of the biggest risks to civilization is the low birth rate and the rapidly declining birth rate. And yet so many people, including smart people, think that there are too many people in the world and think that the population is growing out of control. It's completely the opposite.
People have been wondering about population resources for a very long time, but in 1798, an English pastor and economist, Thomas Malthus, wrote a very influential book in which he argued that resources grew at an arithmetic rate or linear rate, 1, 2, 3, 4, that's the blue line, whereas population grew at an exponential rate, 1, 2, 4, 16, 32, and that's the red line. And he believed that the difference between these two rates of growth, population growing fast, resources growing slow, he believed that the difference must result in starvation. Since Malthus died, and today, the world's population increased from 1 billion to 8 billion. There are 8 billion of us today. You know what happened? Famines, which were once common in the world, have disappeared. 16th, 17th centuries, tens of millions of people used to die in the most advanced countries because they didn't have enough food. Today, famines are gone from the world except for war zones. In sub-Saharan Africa today, people have access to as many calories as the Portuguese did in the 1960s. Today, our fear is not so much hunger as it is obesity. And what we can do is to quantify the increase in resources, including food, by looking at time prices. Time price basically means, time price tells you how long you have to work in order to buy something, okay? Why are we using time prices? Well, because if we are looking across the world at different countries, if we are looking at different time periods, instead of translating prices, pesos to dollars and purchasing power parities, what we do, we ask how much meat, pork, rice can an hour of work buy you in different countries. So for example, if in Mexico a loaf of bread costs 100 pesos and you are making 100 pesos an hour, that means a loaf of bread will cost you 1 hour. If you are making 200 pesos an hour in Mexico and the cost of bread is 100 pesos, then that means that you only have to work 30 minutes, okay? So everything I'm going to be talking about is delineated in time prices. Time prices use minutes and hours of work, and that's different from normal prices, which use dollars and cents and pesos, etc. So let's start by looking at the global level. We are looking at 50 commodities, most important commodities in the world, between 1980 and 2018. This is the much maligned period of globalization that so many of my fellow Americans complain about. What happened to the prices of resources? The time price of pork globally fell by 85%. That's the red bar. which means that you can now get 6.5 pounds of pork for the same amount of work that would have bought you just 1 pound of pork in 1980. Salmon fell by 81%, rice by 79%, wheat by 76%, corn by 73%, and on average, these 50 commodities, and I'm just showing you a few of them so that you can read it, okay, for legibility, but on average, food, minerals, metals, and fuel have fallen by 72%, which means that your personal abundance has increased by 252%. You can now get 3.5 times as much as you could in 1980. Now, some people will ask, is this speed of progress, is this increasing abundance fast enough? Well, I would remind you that for tens of thousands of years, your standard of living would be the same as that of your father and your grandfather, and that of your children and your grandchildren. It was stagnant. It never changed. And here, in a space of 38 years, we are seeing an increase in abundance from 1 to 3.5, which means 250%. We can look at the same data, but from country perspective. Okay, so far I just gave you the time prices of different commodities. Now let's look at countries. Again, we are talking about 50 most important commodities in the world. In China, between 1980 and 2018, the time price of 50 commodities falls by 98%. Chinese today get 40 times as much as they did in 1980. So when they ended communism, suddenly they had this amazing flourishing of abundance. They're 40 times richer than what they were. India, 82%. They also abandoned socialism in 1991. United States, 70%. The best performing country in Latin America, Chile, 69%. In our work, we looked at 37 different countries, the most important economies in the world, and I'm sorry to say that Mexico came last. In Mexico, time prices for these 50 commodities fell by 41%. That was the last. But that still means that today, a typical Mexican is 70% better off in terms of his access to commodities than he was in 1980. So, you remember this chart. Malthus believed resources grow slow, population grows fast. In reality, this is the reality. It is resources which are growing at a faster pace than population. How can we say that? We know it because even though population of the world has increased from 1 to 8 billion, resources have become cheaper, which means that resources are growing at a faster pace than population. And the difference between these two rates of growth can be explained by the new knowledge produced by the human mind. In our model, we always start with the total population. The more people you have, the more likely it is that somebody will come up with an idea that is going to change the world for the better. So the more people you have, the more people are there who are more likely to come up with a good idea. My favorite example is Patrick Bell, who in 1828 invented the first very primitive wheat harvesting machine. Over the next 200 years, the free market has improved on this very primitive harvest machine. Bad ideas fell by the wayside. Good ideas were embraced. And the primitive wheat harvesting machine became a sophisticated combine harvester, which is the reason why today we can have abundant bread at reasonable prices and nobody has to starve. Of course, having more people is not enough. If having just a big population was enough, China would have always been the richest country in the world, because China has been the most populous country in the world for 2,500 years. But it was only when China abandoned communism, when it allowed people a degree of freedom, that China stopped being extremely poor and became very rich. Okay, so moving forward, in the next decades and centuries, Mexico and the United States and China and India, we are all going to be using much more resources. And the question is, can we keep superabundance going? Can resources continue to become cheaper, or are we going to run out? Well, not if Kenneth Boulding has anything to say. The American Economist says that anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist. But what I'm going to try to explain to you is that from a wealth-creating perspective, the number of atoms means very little. Consider this example. This is Lamborghini Huracan worth $250,000. And this is Lamborghini Huracan worth $5,000. The number of atoms in these two cars are exactly the same, but they've been arranged in different ways. The first intelligently, the second chaotically. So by arranging atoms in an increasingly intelligent way, we can create more value for everyone. Let's consider some of the ways of doing so. 1, increased supply. When things go up in price, people look for more deposits of resources. Today, we have more known resources, more known deposits of oil than ever before. Why? Because people were looking for the new deposits. There is also technological breakthroughs, which means that before, when oil seemed very expensive, you couldn't get to it. But now, with fracking, you can get to oil which was previously too expensive to get to. We can also increase efficiency. A can of Coca-Cola in the 1950s weighed 3 ounces of aluminum. Today, it weighs ½ an ounce. We are also breaking away from resource use in absolute terms. For the longest time, Mexican and American and Canadian economies were growing, and so was resource use. Resource use and economies were growing in tandem. But since the year 2000, in the most sophisticated economies in the world, such as the United Kingdom and the United States, what we have seen is that the absolute amount of resources is falling whilst the economies continue to grow. We can increase value from a single atom. When we first started using sand, we used it in order to create jars and mugs, and later, much later, we started using sand in order to create windows. But today, we are using sand in microchips and fiber optic cables. So with every step of the way, the added value from the grain of sand has increased tremendously. We have new uses for things that we previously didn't know what to do with. When people were first digging for oil, there was a lot of natural gas that escaped along with oil. What did we do with the gas? We burned it, thus damaging the environment. But today we know that gas is just as good for lighting our homes, creating electricity and heating our homes as coal is, except that gas only emits half as much CO2 into the atmosphere as oil does. So, new uses. Substitution. We used to kill whales in order to get their oil, from which we created candles so that we could read by the candlelight. Today, we use electricity. People are terribly concerned about where is all that lithium which is going to power Elon Musk's cars. Well, maybe we will not need lithium in 20 years' time. Maybe we will be switching to sodium-ion batteries, and there is much more sodium in the world. So substitution. Just because you are using something today doesn't mean that you are going to be using it in 20 years from now. Dematerialization. 15 years ago, if you walked into any hotel room in the United States, there was a thick copper cable running from the wall to your computer. The only way to get on the internet was to plug your computer into a thick copper cable which ran into the wall. Today, we use Wi-Fi. What happened? We have dematerialized. We are using zero copper, zero resources in order to get to the internet. We are using air. Dematerialization. Your iPhone, it's your camera, it's your notepad, it's your map, it's your telephone, it's your radio. Instead of using all of those resources in order to create all of those different electronics, you just had an iPhone. Reuse. Just because something has been used in a certain way doesn't mean that we are always going to be using it in that way. During the Manhattan Project, when the United States was developing a nuclear bomb, The only way they could do that, the only way they could create electromagnets to separate uranium, they needed silver. But they didn't have any silver. So the United States government gave them 14,000 tons of silver from which they could create electromagnets in order to create nuclear bombs. After the war, all that silver was returned back to the government and is now being used in order to prop up the American dollar, supposedly. Transmutation. Through nuclear reaction, we were able to transmute lead into gold decades ago. Why don't we do it? Because it's extremely expensive. It requires tremendous amount of energy in order to do that. But if in the future we have fusion reactors and cheap and abundant energy, we can transmute any metal into any other metal, any element into any other element. The universe, the Big Bang, only created hydrogen. Where do all the elements come from? We have 100 elements in the periodic table on Earth. But the universe, Big Bang, only created hydrogen. They were created inside stars through fusion reactions. And we can replicate that process. And if we really, really need more resources, we can always mine them. Already we have sent a probe to asteroid Psyche, which is rumored to be worth $10 quadrillion because it's composed of platinum and gold. In 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, when we need more resources, we'll be mining them in space. So, economics is not about counting atoms. Economics is about knowledge, and knowledge is potentially limitless. The world is a closed system in the same way that the piano is a closed system. Piano only has 88 keys, but the number of songs on the piano are infinite. And the same applies to our planet. The Earth's atoms may be fixed, but the possible combinations of those atoms are practically infinite. What matters then is not the physical limits of our planet, but human freedom to experiment and reimagine the resources that we have. Thank you very much.